You, everybody. So thank you for joining. This is going to be a real whistle-stop introduction to the main roles within your committee. I'm only going to very briefly mention the main responsibilities as the committee as a whole, and focus on the key duties of the chair, the treasurer, and the role of secretary. If you'd like further information about recruitment onto the committee, codes of conduct, dealing with challenging situations, effective AGMs, or any other aspect of your committee, there are resources available, and you can, of course, always request tailored support from Plunkett as a group by requesting some extra support. But I just want to do a brief introduction as to a little bit about committees and their responsibilities. We're going to start out a little bit with the legal responsibilities of what you're going to do. Then I'm going to move on to those essential committee roles and what the key duties are within those. And then I might mention a little bit about recruitment and other things. So I'm sure that you're all aware with this sort of situation when it comes to committees. And we really want to make sure that you have an effective committee that is running well. And the key thing about committees is it all comes down to the quality of the people that you have involved. And generally speaking, days of your committee, it tends to be people that know each other very well. In that starting phase, if you're starting a community business of some sort, generally speaking, the core group of people that start out as the initial chair, treasurer, secretary are probably all in the same boat. They know each other and have the same aims in common. However, committees develop over the years. Different people get involved. People have different values, different visions for their society. And that's sometimes when issues can happen. And sometimes the people that have come onto the committee at those later stages maybe don't understand some of the initial decisions that have been made. So just a reminder, the management committee basically are collectively responsible for everything done by the business. So when we talk about collective responsibility, as a CBS, which most of you will be, you have shared liability as a committee. No one individual is responsible. And so it is important that although some of you may well have those key roles of chair, treasurer, and secretary, this does not mean that the other people on the committee are less valuable and less necessary when it comes to deciding on vision, values, decision making, etc. Most of you will fall into one of these two categories of committee. You will either be a non-executive committee, which means generally speaking, you have a paid manager who is doing a lot of the work. And really your role, once you're actually operational, so not necessarily obviously when you're setting up, but in those later stages, once you're operational, most of the work of the committee is more to do with strategic oversight and governance. Most of the day-to-day operational work is done by somebody like a manager. Or you could be more of an executive committee, and this is more common for our community pubs that have gone down the non-tenanted role, where the committee is very hands-on and are involved very much in the day-to-day running of the organisation. So some of you will definitely be one, some will be the other, and some of you will be a bit of a hybrid between the two of you. The main responsibilities of the committee are set down here, and as I say, you will get a copy of these slides, so don't feel you have to make terrible number of notes. So your responsibilities to have regular meetings, and those meetings, generally speaking, should be once a month, but some groups will do them more frequently, depending on any challenges they've got. Others will go and and have less frequent ones. I do know of some community businesses that only actually have them once a quarter. We wouldn't recommend that because I think that then you don't have sufficient handle on the business. So generally speaking, about once a month, that should have an agenda and will be minuted. So you're also, as a committee, responsible for looking after the members' assets. So you need to keep a membership register, and you also need to make sure that your members understand what it is that they are involved in, because all the members are a member of your legal structure. Committee is obviously also responsible for engaging and involving its members, not only via an AMM, but also keeping in communication with them in the early days. This may well be to do more with fundraising and working together as a team to set the project up. In later stages, it may well be developing certain projects, or it may well be just wanting to keep them involved. The more your members are involved and included and kept informed of what the committee is up to, the more likely they are to become active customers and interested participants, and the easier it is for you to try and recruit them onto the committee itself. The committee obviously is responsible for managing that shares register, and that's governed by your model rules. You're required to have an AMM every year as a society, and after that AMM, you need to make sure that you submit your annual accounts and your annual return. So your main responsibilities of the committee are to be financially solvent and to ensure that you understand the financial reports that you are going to be presented with, and that you ensure that the annual return, payment of VAT, corporation tax, and anything else is done timely. That doesn't mean you have to do it yourself, particularly if you have a commit, say a manager, but you need to ensure that it is done. So your role is one of monitoring, if not of action. The committee is also responsible for the health and safety and well-being of any volunteers and paid staff. And that includes, obviously, if it's paid staff, you are their employer and you have those responsibilities of appraisal, wages, PAYE, etc. The committee is also responsible for managing the statutory requirements of the society, which could range from that health and safety, your alcohol license, food hygiene, and making sure that all the policies and procedures are in place. And again, it does not mean that you have to write them all. It does not mean that you have to implement all the procedures, but it does mean that you are responsible for ensuring that that policies and procedures background is there and up to date. And that includes, of course, things like GDPR and managing all the information carefully. We're all pretty aware in the last couple of weeks with the problems regarding cooperatives and Marks and Spencers. So keeping tight control and good governance on your data is also very important. So we're now just going to move on a little bit more to the actual committee roles themselves. When you get people onto the committee, ideally you should provide them at that recruitment stage with a role description that lays out what the expectations are for the role, so that people don't go into it without thought about the implications of what it is that they are doing. And we at Plunket do have some example role descriptions should you need them. There should also ideally be a person specification that's different to a role description. It may well be more focused on the skills that are needed. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, particularly when looking at the role of the chair. And make sure that you are referring to your governance, like your model rules, to make sure that you are in line with that. So remember that the membership vote people onto the committee. They do not vote them onto roles. So you may well have somebody that's moved into your community that you think would be a great treasurer, but they are not being voted on as treasurer, even though in theory you may have headhunted them for that specific role. The members only vote people on to the committee. You as a committee decide who is most appropriate for each role. When you've actually got them onto the committee, it is really important that you put in place a good induction process to make sure they understand what it is that they're doing, how it works, when you have meetings, where they are, where the minutes come out, action points, who's responsible for what, where past minutes are kept, where copies of risk assessments are. So the better your induction in those early stages, the more included the new members of the committee will feel. You may also decide that there's a training element to becoming a committee member, and we again provide a skills audit document that allows you to look and see what people feel comfortable with within the committee. So I was going to start a little bit with what is a secretary, because this is the role that people get most confused about. Many of us still initially think of a secretary as the person typing away in the corner incredibly quickly and making notes of meetings. In the terms of your community business, the role of secretary is one of society secretary, which is the equivalent of being a company secretary. So society secretary is a very specific role to do with governance. So it's a strategic job, and although taking minutes and organising and keeping things on track is a key part of that role, the main part of their responsibility is to ensure good governance on behalf of the society. They are the main point of contact with the governing body and the FCA. They are the main contact for your members. And should there be any queries, or when you're inputting for things like grants, the society is normally the main point of contact for that. So you may hear groups just refer to them as company secretaries, society secretaries, or just secretary. But throughout this, it is easier and provides more clarity to refer to them as a society secretary. Some organisations that we are aware of will split the role, and they will have a minutes secretary who deals with the more day-to-day running of the committee meetings, and then the society secretary who is more responsible for the governance aspect. The majority of groups will combine it into one role. So in summary, the secretary is responsible for ensuring that meetings are effectively organised and minuted. Poor minutes are one of the key problems that we see with groups, and so when you are looking at putting somebody into the role of secretary, it's very important that you consider how they participate in meetings at the same time. Some people are really skilled at taking notes but also participating. Other people, if they're taking notes, will feel that they cannot participate. Recently, more and more groups are utilising technology to help them with this, and either recording and transcribing their meetings through software, or they will have different people at different meetings taking notes, and then the secretary collates that at the end. If you're setting up your meetings, it's good to have an agenda in advance and your minutes well in advance, because if those minutes have actions, there's nothing worse than only getting the minutes on the day before the committee meeting and suddenly remembering that you'd agreed to do something. So generally speaking, the secretary needs to be prepared to put some time in between the meetings to ensure that the information after the meeting is prepared in a timely manner in advance of the meeting. The secretary will also normally maintain effective records and administration, so they'll be responsible for keeping your archive up to date. That doesn't mean that there aren't other people within the committee that are doing that, but it is the secretary's role to ensure that there are those effective records in place, and in a situation where they can be passed on to the next secretary, the next committee. Because again, one of the key problems with groups is when key people leave the committee, if that's not in place, then the next committee struggles to put all the information and spends quite a lot of their year reinventing the wheel. The secretary is also important when it comes to looking at those legal requirements, whether that's charity law, company law, or in our situation, the interpretation of the model rules. And we would always encourage groups that if they have any questions regarding their governance and the interpretation of the model rules, that they do come to us at Plunket and we can support them with that. They may well also be responsible for deciding at what stage you want to update your model rules. Obviously, they keep, major part of the role is that communication and correspondence thing. But although the secretary ensures that all these things are being done, quite a lot of this can be delegated to either paid staff or volunteers. But it is the secretary's role to ensure oversight for this. So they're very much a key linchpin within your committee. Many of the secretaries that we deal with actually stay in that role for several years. I'm just wanting to go here into a little bit more about the secretary's role very specifically. Much of the year, if things are going well within your society, it may be relatively quiet for the secretary, but their key time of busyness is around your AMM time, because they are responsible for the organisation and holding of your AGM or your AMM. They need to arrange that any auditing of the accounts and working with the treasurer on that. They are responsible for doing the annual return to the FCA. They are responsible for doing things like keeping the balance sheet, keeping the register of members up to date. Again, a lot of this is in coordination with the treasurer. But that kind of communication side of things is quite key. And as I say, the busiest time of year for your society secretary is normally 1.5 months before your AMM and 1.5 months after. They tend to be the key time for a society secretary. Actually, during a meeting, the responsibilities may well be to ensure within the minutes on progress of the work, to look at any correspondence, make sure that you're quorate, and record those meetings. So it's very laid down rules for what a secretary needs to be prepared to do. Just a reminder that if you are using the Plunket rules, you must have a secretary. It can be quite difficult to recruit one, but it is a requirement. And at the setting up stage, the role of the secretary is the only one that the Financial Conduct Authority are interested in. They don't care at that point who's chair, who's treasurer. They only want to know who is your society secretary. And as such, the secretary of your society does not have to be a member of your society, of your community business. It is the only role that does not have to be. So this is because it can be that somebody that's taken on this role of governance does it for several other societies. And so their role very much is a case of, I'm not a member, but I'm doing this professionally for you. And it can be that you decide that that secretary role is a paid role. Normally, if they are not a member of the society, they can be paid. If, however, they are elected onto the committee and fully participate as a member of the committee, that is a non-paid role. So I anticipate that I might get more questions about that, and I'm happy to provide more information later on if anybody wants to go into that in more detail. So the sort of person that you're looking for, you obviously want them to be committed to the organisation, willing to devote that necessary time, as I say, for doing things like minutes, be very organised. These days, a lot of groups will have an online filing system of something like Google Docs, and often the secretary will be the person for making sure that that is in place. Ideally, they should be good at admin and clear and good communications. So I'm now going to move on to the committee roles of treasurer. I'm sorry, this is very, very fast, but as I say, there's a lot to cover, and I want to make sure that you all have plenty of time for asking questions at the end. So the society's treasurer. Again, this is one of the key roles that is required within your model rules. The size of the role will depend, again, very much on if you have a tenant, if you're running a pub perhaps, if you have a particularly competent manager who is prepared to do a lot of the day-to-day financial work, or if you can actually afford to employ a bookkeeper. But generally speaking, the treasurer's role is one of oversight of the financial management of the society. And they need to make sure that they work closely with the rest of the committee to ensure that you have the financial stability for your community business to proceed. Again, it may be that you're not doing all the work yourself. You may delegate to volunteers, you may delegate to staff, you may delegate to professionals. But when the buck stops, it stops with the committee as a whole, and the treasurer's role is one to make sure that the rest of the committee understand their responsibilities with regards financial controls. So in summary, the treasurer is responsible for that kind of general financial oversight that we're going to talk about. One thing is, this role can be absolutely huge. So some groups that I hear of, their treasurer is working 2 or 3 days a week full time as the treasurer, which is a huge commitment. It may be at some point you get a treasurer that is prepared to give all that time and energy and that competence, but that can be a real risk if you don't put in place some safeguards and some preparedness for the next steps. Because if you then have somebody comes on board as a treasurer who is less experienced or has less time, that can often cause issues for that society at a later stage. So I would describe the treasurer as a watchdog role over all aspects of financial management, working with those other members of the management committee to safeguard the organisation's finance. The treasurer needs to act as an information source for the management committee regarding those legal requirements and the current financial status and documentation that is required. So they will often, for example, be required to oversee and present budgets, the accounts and financial statements to the management committee. And again, the management committee may well be made up of people with different skill levels when it comes to understanding financial statements. And so it is important that the treasurer is able to clearly communicate and interpret the data so that the whole committee understands the financial situation so that they can make informed decisions. it's not acceptable for the rest of the committee to wash their hands of the financial aspects of the society. And so it is not the treasurer's job to be able to say it's only me that deals with the finances. So you need to make sure that the financial systems and controls are in place. That may well be about keeping record keeping, making sure that you're complying with the requirements of any of the funding bodies. So if you've managed to be lucky enough to get grants or loans, they may well require you to provide financial information for that. When it comes to budget and financial forecasting, the treasurer needs to be on top of the finances so the organisation knows how well it's tracking against any approved budget and how to respond if there's any particular problems. I often think that having a small financial subcommittee is a really good idea who can work closely with the treasurer to develop analysis of those finances and divide out the work. So it could be that within a financial subcommittee, one person takes responsible for payment of bills. Somebody else is more responsible maybe for looking at things like getting the best deals for your insurance and your electricity. It could be that somebody else is responsible for paying the wages and the PAYE. Somebody else might be responsible for the financial forecasting. So considering having a financial subcommittee can be a useful point for the treasurer and can make it seem less daunting. So you do need to make sure that you have things like budgets in place so that you can track and understand that information. But each management committee will have its own way of doing things. And the way that you share out that work will depend on the skills and interests of time that the treasurer has to offer. It's important that the role of treasurer matches the dynamics of your organisation. So as I say, in the early days, the treasurer's role may well be very much involved in preparing all the financial information for any business plans, projections, cash flow forecasts for maybe 3 or 5 years. Later on, it is more about spot checking things, ensuring that things like overheads do not get out of hand, helping define things like your capex schedule, your reserves policy, your gross profit margin targets that you want any staff to commit to. We do have a resource on the role of treasurer if anybody is interested, alongside a description of a financial subcommittee. So in the early stages, getting that bank account can be quite challenging for some groups. The treasurer will be the named person on most of your accounts and most of your contracts, but it isn't a requirement to do so. They do not need to have any professional skills, but again, a lot of groups will try and utilize former accountants, people that have managed businesses, that have dealt with financial arrangements before. But generally speaking, people that are involved as treasurer generally need to be committed to the organisation and again prepared to put the necessary time in. Ideally, they need to know the administrative processes. So whether that is utilising Excel, whether it's using QuickBooks or Xero, and any other financial tools that are needed. But you don't need to be finding people with expert knowledge of things like Sage necessarily. Groups that are slightly better off in the position may well, as I say, look at employing a bookkeeper who can often do a lot of that day-to-day financial admin, and then who will then present the reports to the treasurer for the treasurer to interpret to the committee and the staff. So just as a Summary there, the Treasurer is responsible for general financial oversight, funding, fundraising and sales, the financial planning and budgeting, financial reporting, and the banking, bookkeeping and record keeping. And so their legal requirements are to make sure it meets your financial requirements and that you basically are trading and not insolvent at any point. So your treasurer should have clearly documented policies and procedures, keep up to date with any legal requirements, and work with other members of the committee members to put together, in particular, an annual budget. The treasurer can also be involved in those next stages. And as I say, if you have an assistant treasurer or a subcommittee, bringing them on board. We often find that societies that have a project coming up on the side may end up almost with two treasurers. So if, for example, you are a community shop and you're hoping to put an extension on the side, the financial and business planning for that extension may need not only the support of the existing treasurer, but you might then end up with somebody else that's responsible for looking after the budget for that specific project. So moving on now to chairs. The role of chair, people think it's a really important role, and in some ways it is, but not necessarily for the same reason that people always think so. It's not about power. It's not about being at the top of the tree. It's not about being the leader as such, but it does have some very specific perceptions within your organisation. So there are lots of different types of chairs, and what you want and need from your chair will depend where you are with your community business. So if you are starting out, you may need a chair that is very dynamic, who is quite prepared to push things through, to keep things moving, to engage with lots and lots of stakeholders and other groups and societies. However, later on, what you might need from your chair may well be different when things are going through either a challenging time or they're going really well. And so what you need from your chair will depend. Once again, it's really useful to have a role description for that of chair. And we have samples for you if you need them. It's really funny that actually finding somebody who's prepared to stand up to be chair is less difficult generally than finding the treasurer and secretary. More people are prepared to put themselves forward for the role of chair. But it can make a huge difference to the feeling of the society. And it's often quoted as being the reason that people don't join the committee, because the chair is often somebody who has been with the society for many years, and people don't tend to join the committee if they then do not particularly like or believe that the chair is open to suggestion and change. So the chairperson, obviously they have responsibilities alongside the secretary for making sure that the committee functions effectively and that it complies with obviously its governance and stuff. Generally speaking, they will work closely with the society secretary to make sure that the minutes are useful and that actions are clearly defined in a meeting by using recap to ensure that everybody understands what has been agreed. We've all been in committee meetings where things have gone off track and you've spent 3 hours talking about guttering. That's not the sign of a good chair. The good chair needs to keep things focused and moving forward. and making sure that decisions are made in a timely manner, and that actions are agreed on. So the role of chair is very much one of two parts. There is their role within the committee, but they're often the outward facing representation of your society. And so they will do a lot of work potentially outside of the meeting time. They will often be the main point of contact for the community who want to ask questions. They may well be the person that is putting together strategy, meeting with things like your Chamber of Commerce or your parish council. And so having a certain amount of charm and the ability to communicate well is normally pretty key. So we've identified 5 main areas that the chairperson really is kind of responsible for. That of leadership, especially in the early days, somebody needs to decide where the ship is going, so it doesn't just meander around the Mediterranean and end up back at port. So they do need to provide some form of leadership. They need to make sure, alongside the secretary, that the management committee itself functions properly, that everybody is listened to, that everybody can participate. And if potentially you have some quieter people on your committee that don't like to put themselves forward, ideally the chair should be spending time outside of that committee, making sure that they are happy with decisions that have been made and listening to their viewpoints. Obviously, to ensure that the organisation is managed effectively, and often the chair will be the key person to support any staff and volunteers. That isn't a requirement, and if you happen to have a chair who's either incredibly busy or perhaps doesn't have those interpersonal skills of looking after staff and volunteers, it may be that that becomes a separate role with your committee. However, the chair will often be the person that, should any complaints or grievances go through, they will be the people that tend to make those decisions when it gets to be the critical point. And of course, they're representing the organisation, as I've just mentioned, as its figurehead. So there are several different leadership styles that you may well be aware of. These are the Lewin's leadership styles. Authoritarian chairs provide very clear expectations. Doesn't tend to work quite so well with a community business where it's supposed to be far more democratic and inclusive, because everybody on the committee is representing the community and it's not just one person's vision that needs to go ahead. Participative leadership, lots of listening. However, at some point, you need to make sure that a decision is finalised and that the leadership doesn't just wander around and no decisions being made. And then you also sometimes find the delegative chair who is happy to take all the credit for things and to attend the nice socials, but doesn't actually do a lot of the work. So we would encourage you to generally find a chair that is more on the participative side, but that's not always wanted or appropriate. So only you will know what's best for your society at the current time. But ideally, the characteristics that you're looking for is that capacity to lead, that has the style of leadership that you as an organisation think you want, and that can change from year to year. Those personal characteristics, as I mentioned, charm, maybe, good at public speaking, the ability to listen, to be impartial, and to represent the society well, and to explain the vision, especially in these early days. What is it that you're trying to do? Why do you think a community business is the way forward? In the later years, it may be more about how can we keep people interested in the society now they own the pub. How can we get more members? How can we get more people to come to the committee meetings? How can we increase our targets? How do we deal with challenging situations or those situations where people have fallen out? And that's something that does happen in the later stages, tends to be. In the early days, committees tend to be very much rose tinted. Everybody thinks everybody's going to get on all the time. But we find increasingly that after several years, committees can break down, they can burn out, they can fall out. The clear vision may fall away, and it's the chair's job to try and bring that back together. So again, some of the skills a chair needs: decisive, listening, diplomatic, that's quite key within a community. Impartial is also really useful. If you change your chair regularly, again, it's about saying that nobody is indispensable, and it allows the direction of the business to change, but it can also provide that kind of instability. So generally speaking, if somebody is joining the committee for a 3-year term, unless you can't get somebody that's already on the committee to be chair, generally speaking, people will join the committee, be on for a year in as just a general committee member or with a smaller portfolio of work before they come up to one of these 3 main roles in maybe their 2nd or 3rd term in office. The chairing of the meeting is really important. As mentioned, nobody likes those meetings where you think, oh my goodness, I'm now going to have 3 hours of somebody talking away about nothing that's going to be really effective. So it does need to make sure that the chair is keeping those meetings to time, that is recapping, clarifying, and keeping control of the meeting by setting those expectations at the start. So it could be, we are planning on finishing this meeting at 9 p.m. Excuse me one moment. Thank you. So, managing those expectations and making sure that everybody knows what the outcomes are likely to be. It can get out of control in meetings. We've all been there, and probably we all saw during lockdown Jackie Weaver. Keeping control, keeping your meetings calm, concise, listening to everybody's views and reaching a consensus. Within the model rules, the chair does have the casting vote about decisions. So be aware of that. If you have a chair that's unlikely to want to make decisions, final decisions, it may not be the right role for them because they will have that deciding vote, generally speaking. I just briefly now want to talk about some of the other committee roles that you may want to consider. Quite a few of the societies have a vice chair, and it's something that we mention in our model rules. This is key if you are an operational committee, in particular, where you're doing an awful lot of the day-to-day work. Having a vice chair to share the load, to look after meetings when the chair isn't there, or potentially to hive off specific projects and have the vice chair in charge of that specific project, will allow the chair to remain focused on the main day-to-day running of the existing society. Having somebody in charge of maintenance and repairs can be a useful role within the committee. Again, it doesn't mean that the people on the committee have to do that work, but it does mean that they can coordinate it, and that often will need to be in liaison with those main roles. So maintenance and repairs will obviously need the buy-in from the treasurer. Is there sufficient money in the budget? is this something that's essential from a health and safety perspective? Those sort of decisions will need to be made at a committee with input from other members of the committee. Health and safety, again, many groups will offload the role of health and safety day to day to any manager or tenant, but as a committee as a whole, your responsibility is to ensure that you comply with all relevant health and safety and risk assessments and things like that. So you do need to make sure that you have somebody that is prepared to look after that aspect of the society. With regards staff and volunteers and HR, it could well be that that is done by the chair, but more frequently I am seeing committees where there is a separate representative who is responsible for liaison, for doing appraisals with staff, for being their point of contact, for helping recruit volunteers, for example, and for making sure that all the HR requirements of employing staff are in place. So that could be part of a chair's role, but more frequently, we're seeing different people with different skills doing that role. Marketing and communications, always incredibly important. In the early days, maybe that is very much akin to keeping members informed, press releases and things like that. But in later stages, it is about making sure that the members feel engaged, that they are, although the responsibility for looking after the membership list is the role of the secretary, the potential engagement of maybe a newsletter or organising a members event does not have to be the role of the secretary. So looking after and communicating well could well be another role within your society committee. Grant funding, again, that may fall under the treasurer, it may fall under the financial subcommittee, it may be the skill of a chair, but having somebody who is happy to look at grant funding or happy to investigate best deals or contracts can be very important. And having things like a list of when contracts or when grants are around will help you schedule your strategic plans for the future. So just a little bit more about managing staff. As a committee as a whole, you are the employer. Therefore, you have all the responsibilities of being an employer with regards contracts, appraisals, safeguards, holiday pay, and that will require different aspects of the committee working together. So it could be that the chair is responsible for one aspect of it, the secretary might be responsible for the contracts. It may well be that the treasurer is the one that's dealing with the PAYE and the national insurance. But for staff to feel comfortable, they normally need a single point of contact for most things. And so you need to decide within your committee who might be the most appropriate person for that. So clarify those key responsibilities. One of the main complaints we hear about committees is that people come in and step on the toes of any managers or tenants, and that there isn't a single point of contact, and that people perhaps come in from a committee meeting and start giving guidance or their views to members of staff, and it's not always appropriate. Managing and looking after your staff is a key part of the committee work, and it's one of the areas where we see the most trouble, with either the committee not believing that the member of staff is doing their job, or the member of staff believing that the committee is either uninterested or micromanaging them. So if you're having problems with either within the committee or with managing staff and volunteers, do come to us sooner rather than later, because this is an area where things can very quickly get out of hand and you could find yourself in legal problems. So again, having people that have done HR, that understand things like your grievance procedure, your complaints procedure needs to be in place. Same principle, but slightly different for managing volunteers. As we all know, volunteers are absolutely amazing, and it's my real passion is volunteers and volunteering. But the boundaries are a bit more difficult as to what you can ask them to do and how you deal with them. But as a committee member, again, you are responsible for their well-being, you are responsible for their health and safety, and it's really important that you engage and communicate with them because, again, like yourselves, they are giving their time up, and you need to communicate clearly with them, thank them, and keep them informed as to your decisions. Not keeping volunteers and members informed is quite a common complaint that I receive from groups when I'm speaking to members or to volunteers. They say nobody tells us what the plan is. We've no idea why that decision has been made. And that can lead to disillusionment, and it can make it more and more difficult for you to recruit people to volunteers and actually also onto the committee, because nobody wants to join a committee which is fighting or ineffective or dealing with major issues. So just a reminder, the management committee should hold the meetings as it considers appropriate. You should always be quorate, and that means that you need to have a minimum of 3 members of the committee at a committee meeting. If as a committee you experience resignations, you do need to make sure that you cannot fall below 3 under your model rules. And if you fall below 3, the only actions that you as a committee can do is to call a special members meeting. And so again, if you're at that critical stage where you have lost some key people on your committee, come to us sooner rather than later to discuss the process for getting more people onto the committee and how you can action that. And make sure that your minutes, whether they are done by your society secretary, whether they are done more generically, whether you're using technology or not, remember all members have the right to view the minutes, and so they should be appropriately termed because they are open for inspection. So just a quick overview in summary of things that we've kind of gone through, because I want to make sure I'm on target for that 1 hour. So as a committee, you're overseeing the business to make sure that it fulfills your defined purpose and objectives, but those purposes and objectives will change. Your society will go through different stages of storming and norming and reforming. Make sure you manage your requirements, defining your rules. And as I say, that is the key role of the secretary, but should be supported by the rest of the committee. Think about that strategic objective and day-to-day operational management. Burnout is a key problem amongst committees, that disillusionment, too much work. So decide how much you're going to do and be clear about what your requirements for the role are. Provide some training and induction for your new committee members. Otherwise, it could be several months before they're of actual use to you if they don't know what the decisions are, what they need to do, how they need to prepare for their meetings. Make sure you understand how to make decisions, how to listen, and how to make sure that everybody understands how you deal with a decision that you personally may not agree with, but how you still need to be prepared to work as a team to the agreed decision. And make sure, obviously, that your staff and volunteer management processes are really effective for everybody. So to finalise, it's very much about being an effective committee, finding people that are interested and involved. And that's easier said than done, I'm really aware. But sometimes a really ineffective individual can become an amazing committee person. There is a role for everybody, whether they're quiet, whether they're loud, whether they've got lots of ideas, whether they're thoughtful. They all bring value to your committee. But those three roles will help develop and determine your strategy and your way forward, and the key duties that they are performing will keep you legal and compliant with things like Companies House, the FCA, making sure that you can get your accounts done effectively and that you can inspire and engage your members and your community. So value them. And, occasionally remember to say, we're brilliant, because people do forget that committee members are volunteers too, and that they are giving up their time and their effort. And all we can ask of them is that you, as committee members, do your best. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. That was great. Thank you very much. I hope that was clear, provided a bit of clarity and is helpful for everybody here. Thank you for listening so beautifully quietly as well. We've got a question from Hannah Nadeem. When recruiting for committee members, is it better to say in advance what is needed, for example, following a skills audit, or just get people elected and then figure out how to cover the necessary roles and responsibilities?
I think it's a good idea to lay out in advance for people what the kind of roles that you're looking for are, because there's nothing worse than at that first committee meeting after you've been elected on and somebody says, who's going to be treasurer? And everybody looks at each other and nobody puts themselves forward. And that can be quite awkward. And then if you then either have somebody who's unwilling to do that role but is taking it on because they have to, then they're never going to be as effective. Or at that point, you then need to try and co-opt somebody. So saying that, you're particularly looking for somebody that's maybe got skills to be treasurer can be useful. It depends. Some groups have no problems at all getting people onto the committee, but most groups will struggle at some point to fulfill those roles, particularly the roles of secretary, chair and treasurer. So there's nothing wrong with saying in advance and doing a bit of headhunting, because after all, if somebody's moved to the village with those skills, you may as well utilise them.
Great, thank you. And I noted that Hannah had also commented that she would say from her experience that the secretary should also maintain a record of management committee members and when they're appointed and resigned. That she says it's important for tracking when people need to resign for FCA returns, and also that banks will need this information. Which makes sense now that I think about it. I hadn't really thought about that before.
It's quite unusual that as a CBS, at the moment, you're not required to let people know when members of your committee resign. The FCA only require you to do so as part of your annual return. Unlike if you're, say, a limited company where you're required to let Companies House know immediately. That is something that is likely to change over the next year or so. There is work being done by the Financial Conduct Authority that is looking at asking groups potentially to let them know if somebody does step down. The key thing that we often find with banks is when the treasurer has perhaps only had one or two other signatories, and then if the treasurer steps down or isn't available, some groups have had problems accessing their banking information. So again, we would encourage, whether that's on the society portal or with your bank or on your Google Docs, that for every role you have at least two people that can do these things, so that you don't end up getting locked out of situations if somebody's ill. So we had a group last year that, for example, their treasurer went away and the group couldn't submit their accounts on time because they had no way of accessing the information. And this kind of leads into obviously things like cyber security, where having non-personal emails and non-personal storage areas for documents become even more important, so that other members of the committee can access that information. We find it quite a lot at Plunket, for example, where somebody has signed up to be a member of Plunket and they want to, then somebody else on the committee wants to access the information on the hub and they can't because it's in somebody else's personal email. Whereas if they'd had a committee at abchub.com, they would have all been able to access that for themselves.
Yeah, that comes up quite a lot. Thank you, Alison. Helen Meek asks, can you advise what would be a conflict of interest? So I'm assuming in electing people onto the committee, what would constitute a conflict of interest, or what would you need to think around?
So I think the first thing is to say you should all have a code of conduct in place, and if not, please do ask for one. And it should be something that is signed every year by all the members of your committee, because that will safeguard you should there be a problem at a later stage. And we hope that there wouldn't be, but should something like a solicitor get involved, the first thing they will ask is things like, did you follow the code of conduct? Did you follow the grievance procedure? So having a code of conduct is very key to it. There is not an awful lot of clear advice, and so it will depend very much on groups. So for example, when you start out, you often find that maybe husbands and wives will be on the committee. Best practice is that a lot of groups will try and put in place that only one member per household can be on the committee. It can be very difficult to do that, especially if you're in a small community, but it can also be critical. So I know of one pub where they had a committee of 7 and there was a husband, a wife, an aunt and a nephew. So the same family had 4 positions within a committee. Well, that's not democratic and open, that's always going to cause a problem. You also see the issues where people fall out. And it can be really difficult because it's friends, it's neighbours, and having that code of conduct will remind you as a committee of the fact that you are dealing with confidential information. Because if you are in a large business and you went home and told your husband, oh, I had a dreadful day at work and so was a nightmare, then most of our other halves wouldn't necessarily know who we were talking about, and certainly it wouldn't be of interest to anybody else in the community. But in a community business, particularly small rural ones, that sort of information will fly around. So again, it's really important that the committee members have a code of conduct and make sure that they are not being indiscreet particularly about any staff that they are responsible for, and that they are working as a committee. And as I say, there may well be individuals that don't agree with a decision that's been made, but it is majority verdict. And so if a decision has been made and carried, then if that person does not like it, they should remain silent or toe the line, or if necessary, resign. But being vocal in opposition to the rest of your committee is not a good way forward.
Yeah, sounds sensible. On that topic, I've got a question myself. what would you say is the best way to deal with that conflict? Is it to have those clear policies and procedures in place beforehand? Is that the best way to sort of head things off?
Definitely, because it gives you something to refer to. It is covered slightly in the model rules, so the role of the secretary will be partly responsible for that. And it will lay out, the terms of if somebody is unhappy, the process that they need to take. So if somebody was unhappy with something that the committee did, it might be decided by the chair, the methods to proceed. If, however, the problem was with the chair, then the secretary would take that position. But having something to refer to, because if you just say, oh, I was only talking, or nobody said that I shouldn't do this, if you've got a signed code of conduct that says, I agree to follow these terms, then you've got something to go against, because potentially, again, in a small community, it can all blow up. And if it gets to the members or the community as a whole, it can cause real damage. And you're going to be limited as well by things like GDPR and confidentiality policies, and all those sorts of things. So it can all get really messy. So the more you can put in place and have a clear understanding in those early days of the committee, the easier it is should something go wrong at a later stage.
Yeah, and I've noticed that Hannah has put that confidentiality was difficult. One rule that she's had was when she was the chair of the pub, was to strictly ban conversations about the committee, the staff, and decisions in the pub. Which sounds quite sensible to me. Thank you.
Yeah, that happens quite often. You'll find groups having informal conversations in the pub or the shop about something, and they think they're being quiet and they think they're being discreet, but in actual fact, they're not. And that's when it can all go horribly, horribly wrong.
And we're being asked, have we got an example of a code of conduct? And I think we've got one either with the model rules, or we've certainly got one, haven't we?
We send one out as standard with the model rules, but we also have a couple that have been developed that are slightly more detailed for groups that have perhaps had struggles before and that want to provide even further clarity to their members.
Yeah, great. So if you want that, then do just let us know and we can send something to you. It's not a problem. You talked about other roles aside from the three main ones, Alison, and I wondered whether you have to be on the committee to fulfill those sorts of roles that you were talking about, or whether they could just be members as part of a working group. What are the options?
Definitely, you can have as many people helping you. Never refuse anybody that's prepared to support you. It's can be really effective to have a number of subcommittees with members or professionals on them. They work best though if within those subcommittees there is one person who's on the committee who can then feed back into the committee and feed back out of the committee, but will allow that subcommittee to have quite a lot of controls. So if they are doing work on finance, their recommendations are listened to, and so that it's not all being talked about again and again at committee level. So no, the more people you can have involved, the only positions that you have to have as committee members are treasurer, secretary, and chair through our model rules. Most committees we would recommend are between 9 and 12 on the committee. If you have more than 12, it's almost impossible to get things moving forward, and decisions take a long time to be made. If you go less than about 7, unless it's a really small and easy society, you're probably going to overload and overburden members of the society. In an ideal world, with our model rules, you would get a couple of people coming off the committee each year and a couple coming on, so that you end up with a rolling committee. In an ideal world, but it doesn't always happen. And some communities have people on the committee for years and years and years, and others will have to start afresh almost every couple of years with different people. So there's no right or wrong, but the stresses and strains will vary.
Yeah. And Hannah says that having a working group where members and non-members can get involved, perhaps for a time-limited project, it's quite a good way to slowly encourage people to get involved and eventually join the committee by stealth. So that's that's a good tip.
Definitely, gets people to do one thing that they really enjoy, and then, you increase and increase, and before they know it. My husband started out saying he would help backstage at the pantomime 1 year, and 3 years later he was the pantomime dame. So, we're all good at doing that sort of thing.
Very good. And I just wondered as well about the rules around co-opting people onto the committee. What should people be aware that they can and can't do about that?
So you can co-opt people onto the committee, but there is a limit to how many people you can co-opt, because people on the committee have been elected by the membership. Co-option is a non-elected form, and so therefore you should not allow more than a third of your committee to be co-opted. If you've got to the situation where you need to have more people co-opted, or you want to have more people join the committee part the way through the year, then that is when you would call a special members meeting and get them elected onto the committee. If they're co-opted, they will only stay co-opted until the next AMM or AGM, at which point they would then be elected onto the committee.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, we've got no more questions in the chat that I can see. So I think we're drawing to a close slightly early, which is absolutely fine. I'm just going to put into the chat a link which will take people to Plunkett's upcoming events page. So that's where you'll see the current listing of webinars and other events that Plunkett is going to be doing. So have a look and sign up for any that you're interested in. And yes, we will be sharing this recording with you all, as well as the slides. We're being asked about that. So yes, that recording and slides will be going out. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I hope that's been helpful. This sort of a webinar is something that we do fairly regularly. I would say at least once a year we do something around this subject. But if there's anything that's triggered some thought, or you'd like to go back and talk to your committee members and maybe come back with questions for us, that's absolutely fine. Just get in touch with us when you're ready. Or if you want any follow-up from this, absolutely fine.
Thank you. We have done this as a full day for groups before, which kind of goes into the whole of being an effective committee. It goes into the legalities, it goes into dealing with issues. So, there are areas that we can expand on if you need us to.
All right then, thanks everybody, and have a good weekend when you get to it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.